Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot, and today we're going to take a look at a much requested feature, a turnaround. What I mean by a turnaround is simply after we arrive on stand at our destination, how do we set up the airplane to leave again? So that would be called a turnaround in the industry, where we park up and then immediately get the aircraft ready to go back or onto a new destination. We're going to arrive here into Paris Charles de Gaulle in our 320 Neo in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and then we're going to park up and get ourselves ready for a flight over to London Gatwick. We'll be using the fly-by-wire A320NX mod, which I highly recommend if you're using the A320 Neo in Microsoft Flight Simulator, as it just adds so many features to make it a much more satisfying experience for you. As ever, I am a real-world Airbus pilot, but none of this is for any real-world use, it's just to give you some extra context on your home simulations. Right, let's get started. As you can see, we are on a snowy final approach, which adds a few extra things to think about during the turnaround. Sadly, there's no way to de-ice in Microsoft Flight Simulator yet, so we won't talk about de-icing, but I do hope to do a video on that in the future when it's available, or hopefully it becomes available. Right, let's have a go at the landing. I know the landing configuration has been updated by the fly-by-wire team, so yeah, if you find yourself with a different picture, for example, in the default 320 Neo, the pitch is way too high on final approach and things like that, then yeah, make sure you get the update sorted. Oh, there you go, my internet is back. Okay, let's have a go at the landing. As I talk about in my after landing tutorial and my taxi tutorial, have a rough idea of where you're going to go after you land. So obviously we're landing on the inner runway. I'm going to vacate to the left and then go and park up on a convenient stand for me. But you should have some idea of that probably up during the cruise. Your airline will probably park at similar stands each time you go to one of these airports anyway, so that will give you a good idea. Alternatively, you can ask air traffic control. Right, let's go. Autopilot off. Try not to overreact to those flight directives at this point. Just keep aiming for that runway. Just keep aiming for the middle of the touchdown zone, that being these white markers here. Quite good snow effects. They often only clear part of the runway like this, so that's not uncommon to see in the real world. You can see 8 right over there on our right is completely snowed out still. Just keeping 2 whites, 2 reds. I'm not sure why the glide slope has drifted all the way down there.
100 above, 40, 30, 20, retard.
Oh, still a bit sensitive in the flare, even with this mod. So just going to hold the pitch there. Let it settle. Definitely a bit of a long flow, but still within the touchdown zone, so let's get the reversers out. There we go, finally. Once I figured out the button, reverse green, check we got our spoilers up, and that we are decelerating, which we can see on the PFD. Thankfully, even with medium auto brake, we've made our exit. Okay, so let's go to manual brakes and let's vacate onto the left. Down at taxi speed, let's get those reversers in. And before we go over the slash, let's bring those flaps to 0. The reason is we don't want to have the flaps out whilst we taxi on snow, because the engines could blast slash into them and that could cause problems for trying to retract them. So you want to have them up if you're going to land on a clean runway like we have. Then there's no problem bringing them in before we get onto the snow, and that's a safe way around it. What I will do though is just get our engine anti-ice on, just because there are snowy conditions on the ground, certainly. Okay, so let's go and taxi over to our stand, get ourselves turned around. Okay, here we are on stand, parked up. APU is definitely available. Must make sure we have that on before we turn off the engines. We'll turn off the engine anti-ice before we turn off the engines as well, because we no longer need that. So as we said, APU is available. The parking brake is set. Confirm that on this panel as well to make sure you actually have pressure on each of the brakes. And now we can turn off those engines. They'll spool down. As soon as the engines are switched off, you can pretty much turn off the fasten seatbelt signs. as you can see, the slides are still armed. That will change in this mod when we turn off the beacon, the red flashing light. I'm going to turn the beacon off now because the N1 is low. When it gets below sort of 10%, although your airline may have different procedures on that, you can turn it off. The reason is this beacon shows the ground crew it's safe to get near the aircraft. So this is the little red light above, one on top and one below, which I've shown you in previous videos. Let's zoom in a bit. This one down here. So the ground crew will be looking at that to make sure that it's safe to approach the airplane. So beacon can go off, and now we'll see the slides have disarmed. Also, once we've parked up like this, we want to check in the MCDU data position monitor and check the IRSs haven't drifted too much. We have 3 IRSs on board. These are used for navigation, and this little nav 0.0 number below is telling us how accurately they match each other. So if this one says 1.0 and this one says 0 and this one says 0, then this one is a mile out, which isn't a problem. They would typically end a flight anywhere from half a mile to a few miles out from each other, but the Airbus will incorporate all of these plus the GPS and mix them all together to get an accurate position. It's a very clever system. So a little bit of drift is no problem. If the number is over sort of 5 or it's been a short flight, then you'll probably consult the chart. We have a chart where we can work out whether that is suitable or not for another flight, or whether it needs maintenance later on in the day, things like that. So just have a look at those to make sure nothing unreasonable is going on before your next flight. Great. Then, going onto the overhead panel, seatbelt signs are off, the beacon is off. We can turn off the fuel pumps. We no longer need those because we're parked up and they just run electricity. Quite a high power draw as well, obviously, quite big pumps. And the TCAS was already set to standby, but now we can set the transponder to standby once we've parked up. In Europe, you would actually set 2000 while it's still in auto and then set it to standby, but that isn't a worldwide thing, I don't believe. Okay. So here we go. We now have an airplane where the front door is ready to be opened. They'll start bringing the jet bridge over very soon after this. Let's see if we can convince Microsoft Flight Simulator to let us do any of that. Pretty soon after arriving, things that you want to see happening are you'd like to see a fueler arrive. Now we actually have loads of fuel on board today, but let's pretend we don't. The reason we want to get fueling running relatively quickly is because it can be a limiting factor on a turnaround. In particular, some airports will not let you very easily refuel with passengers on board. In that circumstance, you'd need to potentially wait. So we want to get the fuel going and done and to make sure it's ready. Also, if it gets forgotten about at the start of a turnaround, it could easily be forgotten until later. So we'll get the fuel on the way. Obviously, this stuff would happen automatically. You'd expect that baggage services, the jetway connection, to all happen on their own. They said it's going to connect. Oh, here it comes. Wow, pretty good. I'm pretty impressed with Flight Simulator. Definitely. Great. So that's all good. The cabin crew will start coordinating with the passengers to get them off. But also, we're going to put the APU bleed on now. The reason we do this is for passenger comfort. Obviously, it's a cold day outside today, but also in the current times of the pandemic, when I filmed this, it's important to keep air ventilation coming through the cabin, so we'll turn on the APU bleed to provide warm air and ventilation into the cabin. Let's now turn on the external power, which the ground crew will connect shortly after you park up, and the beacon has to be off, so they'll have waited for this beacon light to come off, and we can turn that on. Now, I know we have the APU, so the APU with the Avail light will provide a generator and electrical power anyway, and then we turn on the APU bleed to get air. So why do we need to turn on the external power? Well, you don't. There is an advantage to it though, which is the APU will now burn less fuel because the generator load will be taken from the external power. So now the APU is just providing us with air. So it does have a benefit, even though it might seem like you don't need it. Now, in the old days, before the pandemic, you'd also typically turn off the APU around this point or shortly after passengers have gotten off. But for now, we'll leave it running to give air into the cabin. Great. Okay, so now the passengers are getting off the front door, which is great. We're sat here and the ground crew will start to open up the cargo holds and get everything else sorted. I'm really impressed with Flight Simulator's ground servicing to do that jet bridge straight away, especially with where I parked, which I think is probably a little bit far back. So now we are going to send somebody to do a walk around. So a walk around is done every sector. I have a video guide on how to do a walk around. It's called my Airbus exterior guide, and it is just to check the external aspects of the airplane haven't had any damage, nothing that we're not aware of going on outside. So a visual inspection of those things. It covers things like the tyres, the engine fan blades, the intakes, the leading edges of the aircraft, looking for any signs of potential bird strikes or anything like that. But there's loads of things covered. Do please watch my walk around video where I will go into much greater detail on it. A particular thing we'd be looking for on a day like this in the snow would be ice build-ups. We don't want any ice to have formed on the airplane, but if there is, then we may need to be talking about de-icing, in which case we will have to get that coordinated early on. So that's something that you would do at this point in the turnaround. A typical place to see ice underneath the wing here on the fuel tank is not too uncommon. That can be allowed as long as there's not too much, but on the top of the wings we don't want to see any ice at all. And it can form due to cold spots on the wing. So it's something that we would definitely get inspected at this point, or we can see ourselves by walking into the cabin. So that would be something you want to do early on in your turnaround if you're concerned that there is a chance of icing. Now obviously there's 2 crew on these flights, so while one pilot is outside doing the walk around in the cold, the other pilot gets to stay in here in the nice and warm cabin with the APU bleed running. The APU bleed, like I said, once the passengers are off, we may be able to turn that off to give it a rest. It's very noisy. It's noisy on the outside, and it does burn more fuel off the APU. So we could turn that off, and even now turn off the APU now all the passengers are off, and just sit on the external power. So let's do that just in case when you're watching this video we don't need any of the air for the pandemic, hopefully. So there we go. So this would be a typical configuration, just sitting on the external power. If the external power drops off now, i.e. it fails, then yeah, it will go very dark very quickly and you'll want to get the APU up and running. Right, so that pilot who remains on the flight deck will now go into the MCDU. The aircraft, after a normal flight, will end up on this page, so that's what you'll find. So you won't have the issue of it remembering all the previous things. But in Flight Simulator it does remember. So if you swap the databases in the real aircraft, that would clear everything out. Again, that doesn't work in Flight Simulator, sadly. It's remembered our old route, but we want to go to Gatwick. So I'm going to follow the same thing as a typical day at work, where I'm going to load it in using ACARS. So if I go to MCDU menu, then ATSU, then AOC, init, and then if I go to init data request, because I've got this connected to my SimBrief profile, it loads in the route. So what I've done is I've already set up my SimBrief flight plan, which I'll show you on the screen now. So with SimBrief, I simply bring up the login page and log in. Then I generate create a new flight. Then once I've entered the details in, this is all using the web browser of SimBrief, I can click generate OFP, and once that is generated you will get a briefing page available to you. So it says print view PDF, so if you want to download it you can use that, but otherwise it just loads the route in, it generates all this information, and as a result in Flight Simulator we have a route available to download. So you can do that in the browser at this point and then go back into Flight Simulator. And there we go, it's loaded that in. So I've done my init data request. Next, go back to AOC menu, and I'm going to go to, in fact, ignore that, go to init. You can do your data page again if you want, but you'd have seen that already. And now we can do our diffsrip acronym again. So data, init request, and it's going to load in the flight number, the cost index. It's amazingly clever. This is a part of the fly-by-wire mod, so again, if you can't do this, you must get the fly-by-wire mod for this to work, and then set it up, which I have a video on my channel on how to set up the fly-by-wire SimBrief integration. Right, so there we go. It's uplinked all of that. We've got a flight number, cost index, cruising level. It's really clever, really great. So that's data, init A, flight plan. Here's our fueler. So let's imagine we wanted to just top up the fuel, so I can load that on there. But another way we can do that is through this. So that fuel has already gone on, yeah, okay. Anyway, so that's our departure. Let's say we're going to depart from the runway we landed on then, which was 08 left, just behind us. And then work out your SID. If you're not sure which SID you're going to use, if I click erase, you can see I need to go to APAL. That's my first waypoint. So let's go to departure, 08 left, and then find an APAL departure. Typically, if you use Navigraph, you'll be able to see which charts should match up. But here we go, there's a few different options, so you'd need to figure out which one you need. But there we go. That route now takes us through to Opal, and then the flight plan, and then Gatwick, and you can put in the arrival at this point. Not always required, but if you know what you're going to do, let's say we know we're going to do the ILS 26 lefts, then I can insert that now and maybe add the star later, but typically you'd have some idea from your flight plan. So now you've done your MCDU, you do your full diff strip setup. I've got a video on MCDU setups on my channel, right through to performance, and you can do this now as well. Something, of course, being in the fly-by-wire mod, we have the option to go back into our AOC and we can set up the performance and weight and balance, so we can load on the fuel as we want. So let's say actually that's the fuel we require, that's loaded from SimBrief, so if I go to refuel load, it will actually drop it. Now you can't reduce fuel in the real aeroplane like that. Taking fuel off an aircraft is incredibly complicated and very rarely done, so you just go with what you've got. But there we go, that's now loaded on there. And then if you go to the next page, page 2, you can load on the correct payload as calculated by SimBrief. So it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Okay, so pretty soon, whilst that other pilot's doing the walk around and we've loaded up our MCDU, finishing on the performance page. Now the performance page you would always do with 2 pilots, but obviously we don't have that luxury. Oh no, I don't want to do that. Flaps 2 for takeoff, flex of 55, let's say, and then if you select next to these speeds, it will load in your speeds. Again, I don't want to spend too long on the MCDU. I do have a full tutorial on it available on the channel. There we go. So that's the final part of diff strip performance. Yeah, so now the other pilot will hopefully be pretty much done with their walk around. So what you can do, obviously the MCDU is done, but there are some other checks we need to do. You can go to your checklist and do the preliminary cockpit prep again, all the way through, but that's not what we do in real life. There's actually only certain items of this checklist that are required to be done every single time. So for example, some things we would check in a turnaround are going to be obviously you want to check that you have the ground control on, but that doesn't work in this add-on at the moment. You're going to check the engine oil page. That's very important. Make sure we've still got enough oil, which we do, 25 in the quantity. Then we're going to check that we have enough oxygen still. And we're going to check our hydraulic systems, which aren't modeled in this add-on, but you would check that the 3 hydraulic systems have enough quantity in them. So that is something that we would check. Other than that, it's pretty simple process really. You're going to go back into your flows when you need to. So passengers are going to be coming down soon. Let's get that APU up and running. Let's get the seatbelt sign on. That can go on once fueling is complete, because we can't leave the seatbelts on whilst the aircraft is fueling, because passengers would be strapped in, which is not good. They need to be able to leave should the need arise. So we'll get the APU up and running, let that warm up, and then we can get the APU bleed on. We can pretty much go ahead and turn the fuel pumps on now. Fueling's complete, and there is an advantage to that, which is, as I said earlier, you might find ice underneath the wing on the A320. It's allowed, but if that ice starts to melt, it can form ridges of ice underneath the wing, which is not allowed. You're only allowed a bit of frost. I say ice, I mean frost. So frost is all you're allowed in certain circumstances underneath the wing. So by turning on the fuel pumps, you can mix up the fuel. Because the fuel could be really cold. It does actually show you the temperature on the real aeroplane. So if you had fuel that got down to say minus 20 degrees in the flight, and then you load in a load of fuel at the local temperature, then it could help. Now today, to be honest, at minus 9 degrees, the chances are the fuel going in is so cold anyway, that won't help. But there we go. So mixing up the fuel with the fuel pumps can help warm up the tanks and increase the rate at which those ridges melt away. But there we go. Let's finish up here. So we've got our QNH. We can set our heading to nav. You wouldn't need to do that. The real airplane's pretty good. And you can set the stop altitude for your departure, whatever it may be. You'd need to check that from your charts. We'll have constraints selected for both pilots up here. And now, as you can tell, the airplane is pretty much in a state of readiness to go. So there we go. So some other things going along around the airplane are the bags being loaded and unloaded downstairs. That's being handled by the ground crew, obviously. Also the interior, the cabin would have been cleaned by, well, depending on how your airline does things, but the cabin will certainly have been cleaned in between. And they'll do some checks, things like that, of course, of equipment. The fuel's been loaded on, APU started, so now we can start boarding our passengers and we'll be in a pretty much good position to get going again. As you can see, turning around the Airbus is no big deal, as it were. It's very well designed for this, and the flight deck especially is not too difficult to get it done. It makes information you need quite accessible. So the magic of that is it does make it not too stressful for the flight crew during the turnaround to get things ready, and the result is you're nearly always going to be waiting for something else. And I'm not saying that's an issue, I'm just saying that typically setting up the flight deck is not too time consuming on the Airbus compared to some other airliners out there. There are some exceptions, of course. So for example, today if we had to de-ice, which we may not, depends if ice had formed on the aeroplane, but with clear skies like this, even in the snow, as long as there's no ice on the aeroplane, you might be okay. But if we had to de-ice, there would be a whole other checklist for us to do. If we had any technical issues, it could take time to resolve those, so those would need to be solved during the turnaround. You may need an engineer, you may be able to do some resets yourself, things like that. There could also be issues with flight planning where we need to try and sort out slot delays, talk to our company to figure out a better routing, things like that. So there are reasons it can take longer for the flight deck to get ready, but on a totally normal simple day with an airport like Paris here, where there's not too many issues, then it's pretty straightforward. We would of course now go into our briefing and then our checklist. So the flight crew will brief the departure route. In a big airport like this, that would be very careful briefing of the taxi out. Oh, look at that, it's loaded the route in here. Excellent. Yeah, so that's SimBrief integration, really great. But yeah, so looking at your departure route, briefing the actual SID you're planning to fly, looking at different issues of the day. So are we heavy? The ice obviously would be a big issue, or the snow outside. So slow taxi speeds, we'll use both engines and probably toga thrust for takeoff. All the sort of things like that as you run through your brief. And then finally, you'd go into your checklists and then your before start flow. I've never seen a jet bridge disconnect that quickly. That would make our day-to-day operations much quicker. And there we go, an airplane running on its APU, ready for pushback and start. At this point you could certainly get rid of that ground power unit and finish up your checklists, get going, talking to air traffic control. So let's do it. Let's ground power off. Now the APU can take the load of there. You would tell the ground crew, or they would ask if they can remove it. Do not let the ground crew remove the external power until you've turned it off. So if it's green like this, they can remove it when it's at avail. So now we've turned off the external power, it says avail in green, which means they can remove it. If it's blue like this, then they cannot remove it, because if they pull it, they could get an injury. It's not how it's designed. So yeah, so make sure you've turned it off, in which case it would just say avail, and they can safely remove that because our APU is taking the load. So whenever you do that, check that the APU has avail written here, which means the APU is running on the and providing electrical power if needed. The APU bleed will stay on for engine start, and as I said, we'd have this ground control on. Aside from that, this is a pretty much set up overhead panel. So let's get pushback from air traffic control, get ourselves underway. I'm going to do a video on startup and taxi out at some point in the near future, because that's something I've realised is not on the channel just yet. So for now, this is pretty much a good state, and we can just get going with engine start. That's all for today's video. Here we are, pushing back, starting engines, ready to get going. If you've enjoyed the video, do please like and subscribe. There'll be more tutorials to come, including the promised startup and taxi out tutorial. Plenty of tutorials already on the channel as well, and we'll have some live streams coming in the near future. As I said, something slightly different today, but hopefully it's been useful and enjoyable for you to see what goes on the turnaround in the 320. That's it then. Do please keep safe and well. We'll see you again in another tutorial or live stream soon. Thank you very much. Bye bye.